This is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er 119er. Break. Enemy is unaware of our presence at this time. Over. Solid copy.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Nick Jacobellis. He's a friend of the show. You'll all know him from being here talking about his books, Controlled Delivery. We're here for a completely different reason today. We're still talking books, but now we're talking fiction. We're talking World War II. We're talking gliders. We're talking CID. We're talking the black market. We're going to be all over the place today. So, Nick, welcome.
How you doing, Ben? Good to be back.
It's exciting to have you here again, Nick. So as I was saying in that all over the place intro, Nick, you've written a 4-book series called Frontline Fugitives, which takes place in 1944, 1945, maybe even a little earlier. And it is, world encompassing. So could you kind of give us the overarching premise, and then we'll break it down? This is going to be the first of a 2-part series focusing on the whole series. Today we'll do books 1 and book 2, and then we'll have you back later. But if you could kind of give the audience the general overview.
One of the things that inspired me was a news report of Danny Glover, the actor, who couldn't get a taxi cab at night in Manhattan. And I started thinking about that. And when I was reading Citizen Soldiers, written by Stephen Ambrose, he makes a comment early in the book that the world's greatest democracy fought the world's greatest racists, at the time being Nazi Germany and the militaristic Japanese, with the segregated army. So from my law enforcement background, I thought it'd be interesting to write a book, which actually the first time I did it was a screenplay, about a partnership of a white male army officer who's a CID agent and an African-American police officer in New York City who was a World War I combat veteran. And through a series of events, these 2 guys get put together. I didn't want it to be the typical story where the white army officer was antagonistic and not very friendly. I wanted him to be someone who is a person evolving into the future, where he grew up on a farm in Georgia, and the farm was basically a place that worked and functioned because it had a very large African-American farm hand staff. So he knew a lot of these farm hands, used to ride on wagons with them and listen to their stories about the Spanish-American War and whatnot. And he said, these guys are heroes. Why are they being treated so poorly? So he came from, that's how he grew up. Served as an enlisted man on the punitive expedition. Name is James Beauregard. And got a commission, stayed in the National Guard, became a cop in Atlanta, Georgia, rose through the ranks. World War II comes, he wants a combat command. He can't get one. They go, no, you, law enforcement background, you're going to New York, of all places, for a guy from Georgia in 1943 to the provost marshal's office. At the time, CID did not come back into existence officially until January of 44. So in late winter of 43, they were investigators under the provost marshal's office. So he's working in a task force with New York City cops, state troopers, federal agents, and they're looking at everything involving crimes, deserters, hunting people down that just took off from bases, who stole in 1911, things like that. And they're also working on the black market. Little background, when I was a kid, my father was a World War II Army veteran. He used to take me around. Oh yeah, that's where we used to get tires. That's where we got our gasoline. Black market gas back then was 30 cents a gallon. Regular gasoline was 17 cents. And there was a whole game being played where there was this underground market in the United States. Later on, we'll talk about what it was like in Paris, which was even worse. So I developed these 2 characters. They're 18-year-old teenagers. They're soon to be of draft age, but one kid's an orphan, one kid is come from a broken home, and they get involved in a lot of criminal activity. And when they end up in a bank robbery in Brooklyn, at a bank, Church Avenue and Nostrand Avenue, where I grew up as a kid, went to that bank. So I knew the bank. I could picture everything in my mind. They're robbing the bank. An off-duty New York City policeman walks in the bank, gets in a shootout. He gets killed. Outside the bank is a friend of his, Al Parker. He's the other co-star, so to speak, of the series. African-American World War I combat veteran, saved the life of an American Army officer. And this was some of the things that I had to do over a period of 16 years doing all the research for this story. I had to find everything that I did had to be linked to an actual event because I wanted it to be true historical fiction.
Sure.
So the characters are fiction, but the events that they find themselves in, short of the manhunt, basically, happen. So I had to look up the French Army. Oh, the Fourth Army had American Army officers assigned to it as liaison. So I have this lone American officer in a trench at night, wounded. Al Parker saves his life. That's
So I'm guessing Al Parker, since you did all this research, he's tied to like the Harlem Hellfighters.
Yes, he was in the 369th, enlisted. I think there was 42,000 African Americans who served in combat roles. I think there were 200,000, I think, all total that were in the army, and 42,000 in France fighting. And there's scenes where he gets decorated for saving the army officer, but his medal is given to him in a French army hospital. So, but believe it or not, the New York City Police Department was one of the, for its day, back in the early, in the 1920s and whatnot, even early on when the Metropolitan Police became the New York City Police Department, they had African-American cops. So did Atlanta. So some of the police departments back then were actually not prescribing to the same segregation rules as some of the other industries. Even though they had people staying in police stations, the whole thing about how police departments functioned back then. But the bottom line was, Al Parker saves this officer's life after the war. He sees a picture of him in the paper. He goes to visit him, and his family loves him. Irish Americans. He saved the life of this young Army officer, now is a New York City cop in the police academy. They wanted to become a cop. Back then, everything was done by connections. Al Parker gets the job. He's a cop in Harlem. Fast forward 20 years. There's a young cop by the name of Patrick Murphy Jr. He has a joining footpost in Harlem with Al Parker. When Pearl Harbor gets attacked on December 8th, he goes and enlists in the Army, leaves the police department. They had deferments. He could have stayed out of the war. He fights with the Army, a little backstory, and he said, no, I want to go into combat. So the book opens on Guadalcanal.
Okay.
He's a sergeant leading a patrol, 1943, when the Army went in to start to replace the Marines that were in Guadalcanal, and gets involved in a battle with a Japanese patrol. He's wounded, gets medevaced out. And another thing I had to do a ton of research on, okay, what do you do with wounded troops? Well, they didn't medically retire people unless you were in really, really bad shape. But if you had an injury that could prevent you from performing fully in combat, they gave you another designation and they assigned you to other duties. So if this young New York City cop on leave in the Army, wounded, ends up as an MP, which he didn't want to be, at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. Again, knowing a lot about New York and politics and how things worked back then, he goes to his father and says, hey, get me out of here. You know, it's like, I want to come back to the police department if I can't be in the Pacific with my guys. So they use all kinds of connections, and they get him back in the police department, which sadly cost him his life. And he's a mechanic by trade, speaks German, by the way. And he fixes this young officer's car. And to celebrate, he says, let me buy you lunch. Well, the problem is you can't take your African-American buddy to lunch in any restaurant anywhere in the continent of the United States and sit anywhere near them. So he says, let's go to Nathan's hot dog stand. As a kid growing up, it's right by Coney Island on the beach. You pull up in your car, you go buy your food, you sit in your car and you eat. And there's New York City cops on patrol. They're not going to bother them because they're two cops. So on the way, he says, I got to stop at the bank. Make a long story short, that's when he gets killed. Al Parker's in a shootout at the bank. He is close enough to get a look at the main bad guy and his two accomplices. That accelerates the show. Meanwhile, Major Jim Beauregard and his Provost Marshal's task force is working on a case where they're looking for somebody who they had a shootout with in Brooklyn. Turns out to be Ivan Larson, the same kid who ended up robbing the bank with his two buddies. So I had these two plots in the beginning that kind of come together. And I wanted to put them in a situation where the only witness that can really help identify these guys, when they find out through investigative leads that, oh, they're going to enlist in the Army. Well, okay, go try to find two 18-year-old kids in an army of 8 million men. It's not easy. They've never been arrested before. There's no criminal history of them whatsoever. There's no photographs and no fingerprints. So they actually get inducted. They go through New Jersey. Someone helps them out, gets them relocated, and they end up enlisting. So book one takes this manhunt. And how are we going to find these two young guys? And the Army wants them found, and the police department wants them found. The feds want them found, but go find them. That's the problem. Well, I take these two investigators on a trip. Well, they can't travel together. They can't eat together. They can't stay in the same facilities together. They have all these obstacles that make it harder. They're on an Army base one day and on a camp, and they're doing their investigative lead, trying to find out who can identify these two people. That they're coming up with sketches of what they looked like back then and what they could look like now that they've got their heads maybe shaved and mustache off. And when they go to the mess hall, the Army goes, he can't come in here. This is the first time that Major Beauregard really shines. And he says, Al, wait here for me. And he goes in by himself, and he comes out with two mess hands with two trays of food, and they eat in the back of a 6-by. And this is how he's trying to compensate. Another time they're in a train station down south. A new Army truck shows up, filled with German prisoners of war. MPs jump out, they're bringing them in to eat in a restaurant. They sit down in a restaurant and eat. German prisoners of war. Al Parker's standing outside, bus shows up, African-American troops get off the bus. They go into the railroad station, they get thrown out. They can't eat there. Jim Beauregard wants, and that happened. So I had to put this in the book. This is not, I wanted to write historical fiction that was accurate. So Jim Beauregard goes into the restaurant and has some words with the owner and says, I'm going to have your license pulled. These troops have to be fed. And he compromises. And he brings the African-American sergeant in, and he stands there. Everybody's looking at him like he just brought a Martian into the train station where the restaurant is. And he buys them lunch. And he takes a box of food out to his guys, and they eat outside. But it was his way of doing whatever he could to compromise. So this is their relationship. He has two sons that are in the military, Jim Beauregard. Al Parker has two sons. They're in the military. And through telling the story, you could see the difference. One, Al Parker's oldest son's a fighter pilot, Tuskegee Airman. His youngest son is ends up in part of the Battle of the Bulge down the road as an MP. And part of the story takes place at the port of New York, the port of embarkation, because this is the place where, as you develop witnesses that can identify these people, you have them posted there where the ships are being loaded. If they're on the East Coast, most likely that's where they're going to depart to go wherever they're going to go. If they're going to get, mostly the West Coast guys are going to go to the Pacific usually. So the investigation goes through. I don't want to give everything away, but there's some colorful scenes of the cops doing what they did back in the 1940s to get information from certain people that were being difficult. There's a guy that was involved in the black market that Ivan Larson was involved with, and they had to go have a chat with him, and that worked out fine. So they're picking up these little leads as they go along. And at the end of book one, they figure out that these guys, they missed their goal was to try to get them before they get assigned and go overseas. So at the end of book one, again, by having the bad guys take one notch forward, the good guys are one notch behind them. So I think it's a well-written manhunt story from that perspective. And at the end of book one, Al Parker gets turned over to the Army and is made a sergeant in an MP unit assigned to Jim Beauregard. And his orders are, you're in the Army until you find this guy, put handcuffs on him. On the way back, you're a New York City cop again. So he's got his badge on him, and he's in the Army as a sergeant, and they go overseas. And an interesting relationship develops with a general who's on this B-25 that's converted to fly people over to Europe. And this general, Nathan Trumbull, has words with the major. How do you get to bring your driver and I can't bring mine? And Jim Beauregard says, well, he's not my driver, sir. He's my partner. Now this general is like, this is 1944 now. He said, are you kidding me? December of 44? How do your partner? I mean, he's flabbergasted. He's pissed. I'll have to talk to Ike about this. But they get to ETO. And in the ETO, they make their way. Of course, now it's wintertime. The delay. They're in the UK. They need to get to the mainland Finally, the weather breaks enough for them to get flown over in a C-47. And things are starting to happen in the Battle of Bulge.
So let me jump in real quick, Nick. So does book one end with Beauregard and Parker heading to the ETO, or we now at the beginning of book two?
No, book one ends basically when Al Parker gets basically inducted into the Army because of his World War I combat experience.
Gotcha.
He gets inducted, and Pat Murphy Sr., the officer he saved, is a captain in the New York City Police Department. So he's the one that hands Al his badge back and says, you know, you go get him and bring him back. He feels bad that Al's going to go in harm's way now to bring back the killer of his son, but Al wants to do it, and nothing's going to stop this guy. So book one ends then, and book two begins when they're in the ETO. And obviously there's the unknown factor that the investigators really aren't aware of until the end, is they finally managed to figure out that these two bad guys had gone into the glider program. And I did a ton of research on glider operations. And it was interesting how the Army at first was very picky, which you would expect the Army to be. But when they needed bodies, it went from people that had some flight experience to anybody who was willing to get into this thing with no engine and, you know, just fly it when it got disconnected from a C-47.
So at this point, your fugitives are now glider pilots.
Yeah, well, one is a glider pilot. The other guy is a kind of a colorful story. I had to also do some research on what happened to people that really didn't make the cut. And he becomes a glider maintenance officer.
Gotcha.
They technically graduate him as last in his class if he takes the deal that he becomes a glider maintenance officer. And there's a story in there that I had to develop other characters that would come out later on, as you would find in real life. So I worked as just like I wrote this story initially as book one only. And I liked these characters so much. I said, well, let's keep this ball in play and see where else they can go throughout the war. So that's how come it folded into book two. And Battle of the Bulge is going on. And now we get into the pursuit. And instead of doing a high-speed chase in cars, they're using gliders. And a lot of interesting things came out when I did the research. So you have like 294 C-47s loaded up with everything that you can imagine. In England, weather's bad. They can't take off. So the Army's going like, well, we got these gliders on the mainland. So they have 3 glider missions that they orchestrate. The first one is a single tow, 1 C-47, 1 glider. They had 2 glider pilots on board, 9 medical personnel, an Army major who was a surgeon, and 8 other medical personnel. At the time, there were about 1,000 casualties in Bastogne. The hospital, just like in the movie, got overrun. And there was some people who managed to escape, but it was bad. And outside of medics, and nurses from the town and people who were really helping out, the people in Bastogne were giving food to our troop. They were sharing everything. And they found a lot of, I guess the story about making pancakes and using jelly instead of syrup was true because they found sacks of flour. So they were using that flour to feed people. That's what they were eating, basically, pancakes, because they were running out of rations.
Sure.
So the first mission to bring in had to be medical personnel. I think they had 600 pounds of medical supplies, morphine and bandages and whatnot, and 9 people. So they fly them in, they land safely. The 2 glider pilots go to the 82nd, the 101st, I believe, had a headquarters unit. They put them up in a building, no heat or anything. They were freezing. And they have second mission. Second mission was 10 gliders, and it was all gasoline. They had to bring it all gasoline. One of the problems that the Army ran into, which is kind of sad, that, I mean, I'm reading this stuff going like, what do these generals get paid for? Not that I'm knocking every general, but there was a real serious problem. They didn't have parachutes to airdrop stuff. You can't airdrop fuel and you can't airdrop artillery ammunition. But there's a lot of other stuff that you can airdrop. And there was no parachutes available. So I'm going, how could that be? How could you be in the middle of a war and have all this massive air power at your disposal, but not have all the components necessary to be able to support your ground personnel? That was one thing that kind of floored me. The other thing was when they finally, in mission number 3, they bring in artillery ammunition and gasoline. Well, there was no ammo by the air bases. They had to truck it in. Well, the clock is ticking. These guys are surrounded. There's 1,000 casualties. They finally got some medics in there and some surgeons. The second mission with 10 gliders got in fine. But on the way out, they had problems when they came back. Some of the crew, one C-47 had like 70 bullet holes in it, and from flak. So the crews were saying, hey, you guys got to change the direction if you send anybody else in there, they can't fly over. I think it was Sabrit, another town. It's really bad. They got to zero it in. Well, things got lost in just the way it is. As you know from your military experience, everything doesn't run like clockwork. And that message never gets across. In the third mission, it's going to be 50 gliders. Now, fortunately, another interesting historical fact, after the Holland mission, a glider recovery unit recovered every possible glider imaginable and got it to the 439th Troop Carrier Group. They had most of the gliders. In fact, I think they had all the gliders used for this mission, but they were short on C-47s. So the 440th contributed, I think, 13 C-47s, and the rest were from the 439th. So they put this package together. Ivan Larson, who's changed his name to Danny Gannon, is a pilot in the 439th. Only supposed to be a single pilot in the glider. Francis Shorty McGee, his buddy, who's changed his name as well, he sneaks on board as it's taken off. Again, the good guys are one step behind. They're figuring out, they got a witness comes forward. Hey, there was a guy named Shorty. He didn't like that. He really showed him. He was really emotional when there were like two other guys named Shorty in that unit, but they never got that upset when they were called Shorty. Why? Because he figures that if anybody knows me, it's going to be because my name is Francis Shorty McGee. He's changed his name. It doesn't matter. He's still known as Shorty. He could change his name 100 times. He's still a short guy and he's going to be called Shorty, but he's sensitive about that. So the CID agents, they're playing off on all of this. They're doing armed forces radio shows. So now you got these GIs sitting around listening to these broadcasts, and here's Ivan Larson and his buddy, changing their names doesn't matter. They're sitting in the same ready room, listening to the same broadcasts, and they're wondering, is anybody looking at us like we're the ones? So at the end of book 2, the good guys get into a glider with a team that they put together, including one of the witnesses that can identify him. And they fly into Bastogne. Only, I think, 33 gliders made it out of 50. And it was 60 miles apart initially when they took off. So the Germans said, imagine that 60 miles of ducks coming over, a duck line. And that's exactly what it was. Now, they closed it up a bit. They managed to do that, but it was still a long string of gliders. So they took some hits.
So when the fugitives take off for the glider mission, their intent is to get to German lines. They figure if they surrender to the Germans, they're going to be beyond the American law. Is that correct?
That is their plan. They have no other option at this point except surrender and go to the electric chair for killing a New York City policeman, robbing a bank, being involved in a black market in the state. That doesn't look good for them. What really worked for me was I had a contact in Belgium through Facebook. And Franz de Brat, nice guy. And he got me, I was looking at maps till my eyes were sore. And he found a map of the LZ in the village of Cévennes, north of Bastogne, that had the numbers of the gliders and where they were positioned.
Oh, wow.
So I had Ivan Larson, Danny Gannon, flying in glider 37. I had to make sure that glider 37 made it for this to be historically accurate. And it did make it. In the books, by the way, all the footnotes are in the books. So all my books have the footnotes where I got this information from to make it historical fiction, make it accurate.
No, that's fabulous.
So I knew exactly where that glider was going to land when they went in, very close to the German lines. Bad for the bad guys was just as the Germans show up and go to capture them, American airborne troops intervene and save them. So they have to act appreciative because their bacon was just saved. They're not prisoners of war. They have to find another way to get out, or to get either way, or the good guys have to capture them.
And that's the cliffhanger at the end of book 2.
That's it.
That's awesome. So you said originally this was going to be a screenplay. Was it going to end in Bastogne, or have you added to it as this developed into a book series?
Yes, it was going to end basically at the end of book 2. And when I started writing it, like I said, I thought the characters were so rich that I wanted to do, and the more research I did about the CID issue in Paris, the number of deserters that were stealing the place blind, they estimated, and we'll talk more about it, I guess, in the next podcast, but 1,000 gallons a day were estimated to be stolen by American deserters while these guys are fighting in Belgium and whatnot. This is like serious stuff they were doing.
No, certainly.
The railroad, and again, there's an issue with Army officers, like how they could have maybe changed things. The railroad battalions did not have a mess unit attached to them. So when the guys started to run their trains from after the Normandy invasion, the troops are going, how are we going to eat? Nobody's feeding us. And an Army officer turned around and said, pointed to the trains, the cars that were stacked up on the side of the road, and said, you need food? Where do you think you're going to get it from? And they started breaking into trains to get food, 10-in-1 meals and Army rations, cigarettes. Before you know it, they were going like, this is really easy. Obviously, the Army doesn't care about this stuff. So now they became one of the biggest black market operators.
That's absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, this sounds like a fascinating adventure. I mean, you got a old-fashioned buddy cop story. You've got an international manhunt. You've got the dramatic backdrop of World War II. It's always interesting to talk about, the battle in the Ardennes, and when we're talking about glider troops, the airborne operations are close to my heart. So this is just a fantastic series. I appreciate you coming on. Can't wait to have you back to talk about books 3 and 4 and see what happens with your protagonist. So Nick, thanks for joining us today, man.
Thank you, Ben. Have a great day, and we'll look forward to the next one.